My name is Karen During, and I'm with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science at the Center for Coastal Resources Management, or CCRM, and I'm the webinar host today. Assisting me as co-producer in the background is Circe Gonzalez, the Coastal Training Coordinator with the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and I really appreciate Circe's help today. Welcome to part 3 of the 2020 Virginia Shoreline Management webinar series. This is the last of 3 webinars that we are hosting in place of the annual VIMS workshop that we couldn't hold in person this year. We moved the day-long workshop program into 3 topic-specific webinars. And this is the last one in the series. We encourage your feedback about these virtual webinars as an alternative to in-person trainings and workshops. It looks like we might have to continue using virtual formats like this. So we need to know what you like and what you don't like about them as we plan for future offerings. And I'll give you more information about how you can provide us feedback at the end of the webinar. For today's webinar, we will use a chat box and a Q&A feature. Use the chat box to send us comments and feedback if you need help troubleshooting anything, if you have resources to share, or to ask general questions. The Q&A feature is where you can post questions for today's webinar presenters. Click on the icons to open the chat and the Q&A. Hit enter after you type the messages to post them. You can enter comments and questions for the presenters anytime during the webinar. There is scheduled time during the program today for questions to be answered for each presenter. And if there's any unanswered questions that we don't have time to get to today, we're saving them in the recording and we'll address them in some way, either privately with the person who asked the question or collectively as a group question and answer for everyone's benefit. For the record, CCRM archives the content from all of our annual tidal wetlands workshops on a dedicated website. The 2020 webinar series will be added to this site, including links to the webinar recordings, presentations, questions and answers if there are any, and related links and other resources for each topic. We rely on the VIMS IT staff to process the recordings for these webinars, so it's taking a few days for us to go through that process, as they're very busy right now helping the graduate students get started in their classes. So we appreciate your patience as we work to get the recordings up on our website. Everyone who registered will get a notice when the webinar recordings and all of the other information is available. And again, we thank you for your patience. And now I would like to introduce today's webinar topic, Living Shorelines Performance, and our guest presenters. There is a lot happening with living shorelines, not only in Virginia, but around the nation and even the world. It's impossible for today's 90-minute webinar to cover all the current events and latest scientific understanding related to living shorelines. So today's session will focus on 2 VIMS studies that are related to living shorelines that were funded by the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program. The first presenter will be VIMS shoreline expert Scott Hardaway. He has direct experience designing, constructing, and monitoring living shoreline projects, particularly marsh sills and offshore breakwater systems. The VIMS Shoreline Studies program that Scott leads also developed Virginia's Living Shorelines Design Guidance. Scott's going to provide a summary of their investigation into living shoreline sea level resiliency, including how projects have performed over time and what adaptive management is expected to be needed to help the dynamic living components keep pace with sea level rise. Vegetated tidal marshes in living shoreline projects provide nutrient reduction and water quality protection in addition to reducing erosion. Today's second presenter will be Pamela Mason with the VIMS Center for Coastal Resources Management. Pam is going to talk about another study that focused on how the creation of nature-based features like living shorelines with tidal marshes can garner nutrient reduction credits that can be applied to assist local governments in meeting their Chesapeake Bay TMDL nutrient reduction requirements. So let's get this Living Shorelines webinar started. Scott, if you're ready to begin, we look forward to hearing more about monitoring the performance of existing living shoreline projects and what we can do to make them resilient to sea level rise. So if you want to start sharing your screen and turn on your camera so we can see you if you'd like, you can get started. Can you find share screen to share your PowerPoint? There you go. And now put it in your slide, start your slideshow.
F5 isn't working.
Go up to the top bar and just click on slideshow. Right above your pointer to the right. There you go. And then from beginning. Perfect.
Is that working for everybody?
It works. We can see your first slide. You're good to go, Scott.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm from the Cretaceous. I'm glad everybody can make it this morning. Today, we're going to talk about some projects we've looked at over the years, and we've been involved in the design, construction, and some monitoring of them. They're all Sill sites, and they're located in, two of them are in Virginia, and two of them are in Maryland. Captain Sinclair, Camp Occohannock, St. Mary City, and Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. So in terms of sea level rise, we incorporated, or we included in some of this work what scenarios would be in 2050. And in 2050, there's we usually simplified it to two scenarios: plus 1 foot sea level rise and a plus 2 foot scenario. Okay, Captain Sinclair is off the Mob Jack Bay in the Severn River, and it has fetch exposures to the southeast of about 1.5 miles and down to the southwest of about 2.5 miles. It's fetch limit in a semi-protected cove on the Captain Sinclair recreational area. Now, this is the shoreline, our subject shoreline, our project shoreline that we looked at back in 2015. And as you can see, it's an eroding marsh, typical of many shorelines around Chesapeake Bay. And behind it, about a couple hundred feet, the upland begins, and there's some infrastructure. And I'm standing near a pier there. So the design was basically a set of sills. Two of the gaps were set where there's two existing piers. The middle gap, Bay B, is a little wider because this is also an area where the Gloucester High School crew team comes in and launches their sculls. And so we accommodated that, and we had two more structures off to Sill 3 and 4 along the eroding marsh, plus a gap. And you can see our access pathways to get across that. The construction required logging mats to get across the existing marsh. These are the typical cross sections, which we got permitted for. As you can see, it's very low. The structure, we put at about a +3 mean low water. I mean, the 50-year return interval in this area is 6 feet. For looking at the FEMA studies. So, you know, this thing gets underwater, during storm events. But the key is maintain its integrity in the marsh planted behind it. So we had most of the crew team out there planting. It was quite an affair, and Walter Priest was in charge of keeping everybody straight. We almost had too many people, to be quite honest. This was back in April of 2016. So shortly after planting, the upper left A is what it looked like, 1.5 by 1.5 foot center. We planted alternate floor for the most part, and some pay-tins up above high water. You can see those off to the right there in panel B. And after 2 years, it's done very well. Everything has grown in as according to plan, as it were. And in panel D, I guess it didn't show up too good, but there's plenty of oysters growing in the intertidal zone along there. So the rock structure has been shown to have habitat benefits for not only oysters, but also small fish and crabs and whatnot. This is our baseline and cross sections that we created. I think we're looking at 125, 175, and 325 in the next series of sections. What became evident was that some of the sand that we put in early on kind of got pushed up into a little berm that you can see from between post-construction and April 2018. But it's all, vegetation has all come in there fairly significantly and successfully. Here's a drone image from May this year, and you can see the marshes in its early season growing very well. There's SAV in the near shore. That was something we had to accommodate. We actually had to pull those in a bit in the design and permitting phase to avoid that. So adaptive management, sea level rise. So here are the scenarios we portrayed: a foot and 2 feet. So with the foot, basically the red lettering, we get the alternate floor migrating up, taking over the pay-tins, and the rock structure basically becomes submerged. In the 2-foot scenario, it's all submerged. But what you end up with at the end of the day is you still have a rock structure, which is going to be a reef habitat. The sand we put in there will transition from non-vegetated wetland to nearshore bottom, and so forth. So these things are not going to go away. They're still going to be intact, but they will be flooded. The other location is Camp Occohannock over on the eastern shore on Occohannock Creek. Now this one has a it's very fetch limited, except for this one fetch that goes out the mouth of Occohannock Creek that goes out across the bay. But when you average it out, it would be a medium low energy shoreline. And those are the structures that were put in. You can do a series of sills. A little more at the design. I've labeled reach 1, 2, and 3 for reference as we go through these slides. The cobble sill on the left was not constructed. There was a lot of aquaculture, SAV, and different kind of impacts that impacted the design and construction of this site. So here's some typical cross sections showing each reach. There's the cobble sill that did not get built. But we'll bring your attention to BB, and you see there's a revetment in there. First, the early design, this was a access road that went along the shoreline that connected one part of the camp to the other. It was eroding significantly, and we had elected to put in a revetment, but the funding mechanism was not happy about that. So we converted that to a sill. We raised the elevation, and that's what we got there. And then the sill continues along into reach 2, and then EE is in front of the building there with a 15-odd foot high bank. So reach 1, this is the access road. You can see it, it's a eroding bank. And then after it was planted in 2013, after 5 years, it's really doing well. But one thing we look at is as we go through these sites is to look at how things have evolved in terms of vegetation and other elements. And you can see here, what we have growing in here are pine trees. A lot of our sites that we've looked at over the years, things have started to grow in there because you've created this nice substrate. And so management of these types of features can become an important aspect of it over time. Do you let these pine trees grow up and shade the marsh? Do you manage them? Do you cut them? Those are the questions that are on the table. Reach 2 was a low sill in front of an existing marsh. It's doing gangbusters. So there's been some adjustments in the gap. Lots of oysters on the rocks. Lots of fish cruising around in there. And this is Reach 3. This is in front of the building there, the head camp building. And had some existing marsh there originally. The bank was graded. Some of the sand was available to use. It was pretty fine grain, but it was used as an underlayment. And so you can see the planting there after it was in B, after it was planted in 2013, excuse me, and after 5 years. Now, some of the adjustments we've seen through marshes over the years, you'll see that sort of bare area there where the alternative floor is no longer growing. We actually replanted it, but the adjustment of the substrate was such that it didn't really want to live there. But it's full of fiddler crabs. It's a non-vegetative wetland. It's still good habitat. The sand behind it is up at a +5 mean low water, so it's got significant shore protection capabilities. This is a bank sample we took. You can see it's pretty fine grained. So as we said, we use that as an underlayment for coarser sand that was brought in. It's hard to find good coarse sand on the eastern shore of Virginia. So this was a demonstration project with Chesapeake Bay Trust and others. And here's a series of construction slides, which I know a lot of you like. Here's we've got the rock coming in, being unloaded. This rock came from the Richmond Quarry in Virginia, near Richmond, of course. The laying down of the filter cloth to put the rock on. You see sand's been brought in as an access road. Constructing of the structure itself. Dumping the sand, moving it around with small equipment, and continuing building the structure as time went on. Yes, and unfortunately some of the trees had to go, but that tends to be the nature of the beast when you want to bank grade. So here's the fun part, getting everybody to plant. Drill a hole, put in some osmocote, put in the plant and tamp it down. It's pretty straightforward. Put them in deep. As Walter says, put the plants green side up. A little more planting. Can't get any happier than planting marsh grass. There's the gang. A few cross sections to look at. You can definitely see the change in the bank grade there, and where the sand's been put in. 508 is in that Sill area. There was actually some adjustment down where the creek is. And back again to what are we going to do about sea level rise? And here are the two scenarios. When we in red is a 1 foot scenario, and as you can see, we basically are presenting the fact that the alternative floor will migrate upgrade, take the place of the patons. One of the problems that we're going to run into is a high bank situation. Unless you grade that high bank to a real low slope, somewhere you're going to end up with coastal squeeze where this system is going to finally be flooded out. Lower banks you can grade back, and that transition has more room to move. So each site's a little different in its own ability to adjust to sea level rise and coastal resiliency. But the key is to keep the rock will be there and the sand substrate will be there, so the habitats will change, but they will still be a viable part of the base system. St. Mary's City is on the St. Mary's River in Maryland, and this project was about a couple thousand feet long, funded through some Maryland programs and administered by the St. Mary's Soil Conservation District. It is very fetch limited. It has the longest fetch, I believe, is a mile to the to the north. We had looked at this site. It was put in 2002. We looked at it in 2007, and part of the elements of this project were different kinds of gaps, how you deal with the attachment of salients adjacent to the gap, kind of cutting off movement of fish either way. We put in cobble, revetments, offshore breakwaters, and different things to look at these gap features. This is 2007. And at that time, we did a report for the coastal program showing was an overall adjustment from the initial sand, which you have actually it shifts a little bit. It kind of decreases behind the structure and increases up against the bank. I think that's from a lot of that's from sloughing from the bank. This bank was not graded. It was a 50 or 60 foot bank, and it basically was material kept coming in there to some degree. So this is a section of this particular project looking at it 2 years after construction in panel A. And then I see the alternate floor and the patins behind it. This was very shaded along the bank there. And so the shade typically abates or reduces the ability for the marsh to grow, especially the patins. And B after 11 years, C after 15 years, and then D after 16 years, which was our last monitoring effort. And you can see the alternate floor and the patins and sediments have come in there. It didn't change the elevation. We got salt bush coming in. You can see a lot of shading up against of the marsh grass there. But from a shore protection perspective, it's still very much intact. Looked at one of the cobble bay features. Grasses have finally started to come through that. And looking down another one of the segments in 2007, you can see the cobble there, the alternate flora, and some salt bushes. But you can also see in panel B on the far ground, you see Phragmites coming in. And this is going to be a particular theme for these next two sites, is your maintenance of these sites in terms of invasive species. This is a very telling how after 5 years you have your typical marsh species, alternate flora and patins, your overshading. But after 16 years, the frag has really moved in here. And so the question is, well, from a habitat, we've kind of lost what we created these things to have, but the frags come in and it's pretty tough stuff. So from a shore protection perspective, I'm not sure we've lost anything, but so there's the balance there that I think warrants further discussion. Getting folks to maintain these sites is probably going to be a challenge. This was an interesting part of it. This is an area that had an existing bulkhead. The sill was put in, and just alternate flora was planted there. And you can see after 16 years, the alternate flora hadn't been completely flooded out. It's still very much a viable fringe right in there. No frag is getting into there either. It doesn't have a place to catch hold. And we have some needle rushes moved in, and there's blue crabs all over the place. Littorana crawling up and down the marsh stems. A few cross sections. Not much has changed. There's been some minor adjustments, both high and low along the system there. And so the sea level component. So once again, we got a high bank. The system is not going to transgress this graded bank very easily. The alternate floor is going to take the place of the patin. So what mechanism is there available to continue this system? To really reset it, add sand and add rock is kind of aggressive. The question is, when do you do this? Do you try to do this when you begin the design? Spend a bunch of money up front and have a tall structure? These are adaptive management strategies that we're trying to portray and see how they play out. And our last site's up on the St. Mary's River on what they call Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. This was about almost a mile of breakwaters, sills, and so forth. We're going to look at sill 4, breakwater 4, in a little more detail. We looked at this at the same time we looked at St. Mary's back in 2008, and you see the Marsh it was put in 2002, and it's doing very, very well. And you can see how the sill system took advantage of the existing shore morphology, putting in breakwaters and headlands where they seem to be appropriate. And this was a cross-section of the design, and you can see parts of the alternate floor behind the sill, and then there was some bank rock there that helped stabilize that particular reach of shoreline here on this sill 4, which is on the lower panel. This is sill 4. It had a weir in it. It was about 300 foot long sill. In the middle of it, we'll put in a little weir, and so you can see the consequence of that weir is that the alternate floor has sort of receded back to the mid-tide line. But once again, you still have the lower tide range in there as far as a habitat feature. As you look down where the sill is higher by a half a foot or so, the alternate floor comes in right behind it. And on C, these are all 2018 photos. And on C, you can see how the trees come in and shade out the upper parts of the marsh. In fact, it was very difficult to survey this site because of all the trees and the frag. This is another site in 2008, and then in 2018, a little shaded. But some of the low marsh lower limit has receded a little bit in relation, particularly possibly due to sea level rise in that period of time over 16 years. And then Point Frag, the frag has really moved into this side as well. In fact, in 2008, this section of the sill system had frag already coming in very strong. And in 2018, it's even stronger than it was before. This was an embayment in 2008, was sloughing. It's still kind of sloughing a little bit. There's been some adjustments in that embayment. And this is just a section that we were able to do some surveying and look at the sections, cross sections, and you can see that you get some accretion in 10 years, and then you have some recession. But the middle one is on the edge of the opening of the sill, so that has cut back. And you get these things throughout time on these systems. So once again, sea level rise, alternate floor is going to migrate. Your bank hasn't been graded. One of the issues here, particularly for not grading the bank, was it's very heavy in Maryland archaeology, some Indian artifacts and so forth, so that was not possible. And so what do you do here? Maybe you bring in sand, maybe you just raise the rock structure. These are questions I think we'll continue to ask ourselves and engage with other folks with time. What's the cost effectiveness of doing it? What's the adaptive management strategies? A lot of times, once these systems are in, the landowner kind of walks away from them. And so the monitoring and future adaptation becomes more difficult. Hopefully with some of these webinars and workshops and the ongoing interest in living shorelines, these features will remain at the forefront. And from the last slide, I show CS, Captain Sinclair, CO, Camp Ocklahonac, SM, St. Mary's, JP, Jefferson, Patterson. And I show this because I think the Phragmites tends to like the fresher water just a wee bit better. And so we haven't, although our two Maryland, Virginia sites are a little younger, we have not seen the frag sneaking in as much as we did up in Maryland, where the water is just slightly fresher. And so that'll do it for me this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. We do have a couple of questions for you. If you don't mind, I'll read them to you.
Okay.
The first question that came in was, how much rock was used? This was when you were talking about the Captain Sinclair project. But it's also something you mentioned for the Camp Akahanic project is about the rock. How much rock was used? Where did it come from? And what type of rock?
Well, the rock, there was, I'd say 2,000–3,000 yards in Sinclair and Akahanic respectively. The rock is a granite coming out of the Richmond quarry. And what happened, there are two quarries on the bay. Well, actually, this was brought in by truck. So that quarry also has the ability to load barges. But this was brought across the bay from Richmond. Yeah, it's very durable granite.
The next question is about plants.
Yes.
On average, how many plugs should you use per square foot?
They're planted on 1.5 by 1.5 foot centers. So it's you get one per 2.25 square feet.
So that's sort of an 18-inch center. Sometimes
Yeah.
you can plant them further apart if you need to save money and you have a big area to plant, or they could be planted closer together on 1 foot centers.
You could plant them closer together. I wouldn't plant them further apart. I mean, if you spent that much money on rock and sand, plant should be the least of your concern as far as costs are concerned.
And another thing that's being tried in some places is to put clumps of grasses together or groups of plugs together in a cluster rather than the grid pattern. And we're interested to see if any monitoring results or studies come back on the difference between how well the grass does in those different arrangements.
Right. Well, I think you want to get it covered as best you can.
Right.
We've had experience with trying to take the existing marsh peats in some places and trying to get those reestablished with varying degrees of success.
We've got quite a few questions coming in now. Here's another one. How do you feel about using broken concrete for the sill structures?
Well, broken concrete is acceptable for the core of the structure through the Virginia Marine Resource Commission permit system. Broken concrete can be used in the core, possibly the backside of the structure, as long as it's the right size and it doesn't have a bunch of rebar in it.
Right. And another question about the hard material that's used for these structures are sizes. What about stone sizes?
Stone sizes, to make it simple, if you're in a fetch limited, less than a mile, class 1 riprap, 50 to 150 pounds. If you're in a medium energy, 1 mile to 5 mile average fetch, you can use class 2 to class 3. Class 2 is 150 to 500 pounds. High energy, greater than 5 miles in the bay. Class 3 is 500 to 1,500 pounds. These are Virginia VDOT specs. They make the rock like that in the quarry. As you get bigger rock, sometimes you have to change the armor size. Like type 1 is 1,500 to 4,000 pounds if you're on the open bay. So you're kind of getting out of the sill arena and probably in the breakwater arena. This is all written down in we have this in various documents, I believe.
Yes, in the Virginia Living Shorelines Design Guidance that Circe entered into the chat box is a link to that report with more information about the different design considerations and parameters that you can consider for these living shoreline projects. So I encourage everybody to check that out. A couple more questions. Do you need to protect the area from birds and geese? What's called grazing exclusion.
Yes. Goose exclusion fences. They were actually, sometimes the sill is helpful because the geese don't like to crawl across the rocks, but you need to be cognizant of that in the gaps. And in a low bank, we've seen them come in off farm fields to come into a marsh sill system. So a goose fence along there would be appropriate as well.
And then another question about the materials and specifications are sand types. So you mentioned there's sand used. So where does the sand come from, and how do you know what's the right kind of sand to use?
Well, an acceptable spec bay wide is for the D50, the median grain size to be 0.6 millimeters plus or minus 0.35 millimeters. And with less than 10% fines, which are silts and clays. And that's kind of the general standard spec. It can vary depending on the site. Sand comes basically from local borrow pits. And so, like I was saying, on the Eastern Shore, there's lots of borrow pits, but because of the nature of the geology, the sand tends to be a little on the finer side. On the Western coast, there's plenty of borrow pits with really good sand. And so your proximity, the project's proximity to these borrow pits will impact the cost.
So we have time for one more question, and there are quite a few unanswered questions. And like I said, we'll try to address those if we have time at the end. We'll come back to them. If not, we'll try to address them after the webinar is over. But the last question for you, Scott, is a good one. What would you tell folks who want to DIY their shoreline management solutions, do it themselves?
Well, depending on their capability and their youth, if you want to build a sill in a low energy shoreline and you're willing to use class 1 or smaller, which would be appropriate, you can move rock down there and put those in, and you can get sand loaded and use a bobcat. People have done this. I've done this to some degree. The novelty wears off real fast. And so it's all very possible. There are other construction materials and methods which are available and are probably most appropriate in a low energy setting.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. That was a very interesting presentation that you gave us. And again, like I said, if you don't mind sticking around till the end of the webinar, we might have time for a few more questions for you. And if not, I might shoot them over to you to answer, to help me answer them for the benefit of the group. Because I think most of these are all questions that deserve everyone knowing the answers to. So thank you very much,
and we'll get some coffee.
Thank you. So if you want to turn off your video, and we can queue up Pam. Pam Mason will be our next presenter. Okay, we can see your screen. You're good to go, Pam.
And is it on slideshow yet?
Not yet.
There we go. All right.
Now it is.
Okay.
Take it away.
Great, thanks. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some work that we did, wrapped up January this past year, and it was the second year of a 3-part project funded through the Coastal Zone Management Program with NOAA funds on coastal resilience for shorelines. And so I'm going to talk to you about the second piece, which was looking at the load reduction possibilities for living shorelines along Virginia shorelines. So first, I'm going to do a little bit on the model. Some people may or may not be more familiar with the model, but and I know Marcia presented a little bit last week, but she mostly, I guess that was 2 weeks ago now, she mostly presented on a new decision tool. So I'm going to sort of reiterate a little bit of the function and the structure of our shoreline management model. So again, it's a GIS analytical model that uses biophysical criteria, some sorts of pieces of information that go in there to help the model derive an output for a recommendation for any piece of shoreline in Virginia includes fetch. And fetch is used, determined using a compass rose and all directions from that shoreline and a mean of the longest fetch. Then we have consideration of existing resources, marsh and beach and SAV, for instance. We have our inventory of existing structures, if the shoreline's already hardened, and or if there's things like in the upland proximal infrastructure like houses and roads and utilities nearby. Nearshore bathymetry comes into place in this model for determining some of the feasibility of different shoreline management approaches, and then the adjacent land use. So the model produces one of 11 shoreline BMPs, and you can see in the box there. And the analysis for this study included all of Virginia except for the 3 localities listed, and that was because at that time we didn't have the model yet produced for those localities because we hadn't yet finished all the inventory processes for those localities. So basically the model output gives you these different shoreline management practices, which include non-structural living shoreline, plant marsh with sill. So in other words, a sill, a stone structure with marsh vegetation planting, maintain beach, which means with or without an offshore breakwater, but definitely beach nourishment, growing fields, and then traditional revetment bulkhead toe protection. And then we have some of the special considerations, and I'll go a little bit more into detail on those. So I don't necessarily expect everybody to read all of these definitions, just to be mindful of the fact that each of the practices we have defined for the purposes of the model extent. And some things to note might be, for instance, the maintain beach with offshore breakwater and beach nourishment. We actually have two different outcomes in our model depending on the shoreline length that's being modeled. And if a shoreline is continuously greater than 200 feet, we might recommend removal of a structure. If it's less than 200 feet, it may or may not be appropriate for an offshore breakwater. And so there's may be a different outcome for that. And then of course we define non-structural living shoreline can include, should include marsh planting, should include riparian buffer plantings, may include coral logs or some oyster reef structures. Those are our oyster reef structures, unless they're continuous structures, are included in non-structural living shoreline, plant marsh with sill, revetment, and revetment bulkhead toe protection. And then the special considerations I just wanted to review really quickly. If there is SAV within a certain distance offshore of a proposed structure and that structure sits along a topographic relief, so a topobathy, in other words, the bathymetric depths and the land depths create a surface. And if a breakwater were to be recommended, but there's SAV, the outcome for the model will suggest that you seek expert advice and contact VMRC because of the protection afforded to SAV. Highly modified areas, this was a new change to our model version 5.1. For some of the certain conflicts, we've actually identified the fact that it may be difficult to use a largely remote sense data model to develop an explicit recommendation. So we have switched to suggesting seeking expert advice on some of these other features. That also includes banks that are taller than 30 feet. While that's not a huge portion of Virginia's shoreline, in the intercoastal plain, we definitely have places where the shoreline bank is taller than 30 feet, and that could very much limit what is possible on that shoreline, especially if there's infrastructure near the top of the bank. We have no action needed, and this is for areas where we have marsh islands and some of our barrier islands. And then special geomorphic features, really small spits that don't have any infrastructure and may or may not even be a large enough feature to include any trees, for instance. They might just be marsh spits. We kind of call into question whether or not that kind of feature is a good place to try to modify or manage a shoreline to prevent the shoreline from changing when part of the nature of a spit is to be changeable. So I'm going to dive a little bit more now into the living shorelines load reduction calculations that we did. So this is the table from the Chesapeake Bay approved BMP protocols, and that work was done. Actually, both Scott and I sat on the original team for that, and it was a group of experts to talk about what kind of load reductions could be appreciated or achieved from shoreline management of any kind, which also included living shorelines. And there has been some updating of that since the time that we sat on that panel. So there have been some slight tweaks and modifications, but now, right now, this is the approved protocols. So protocol 1 really speaks to prevented sediment. And so basically this is any practice along a shoreline that keeps sediment from going in the water is calculated as an annual sediment reduction credit. The second protocol is credit for denitrification. This specifically requires that you have vegetation because that's doing the work. So protocol 2 can be applied to any shoreline management practices that include vegetation, specifically in the intertidal zone, so marsh vegetation. And again, it's an annual nitrogen reduction credit. Protocol 3 is a credit for sedimentation. This is sedimentation that's trapped by intertidal and supertidal vegetation. So in other words, as in situ waters flood in a tidal process into the marsh, how much of the sediment drops out into that marsh, and this is also calculated as an annual sediment and phosphorus reduction credit. Phosphorus because it's typically adhered to sediment particles. So when you get sediment, you get phosphorus. And the protocol 4 is a marsh Redfield ratio. This is essentially what happens when we first plant marsh vegetation in an area that is likely to be of fairly low in situ nutrients. For instance, we put sand out there, and sand often has really no nutrients in it. When you plant the plants and they're small, one of the first things they do is rapidly uptake nutrients in order to start production, to grow. And so there's sort of this one-time credit for the immediate uptake from the newly planted plants. So here's a table just showing what that looks like and the assignments. And so you can see in the left-hand column, we have the prevented sediment. This is protocol 1, denitrification, sedimentation, Redfield ratio. And then there's an area called non-conforming and existing practices. And this part of the table was an effort to try to get a sense of what sediment prevention and nutrient prevention was taking place from practices that were already along the shorelines. This approved BMP obviously would apply to all of the Bay partner states, but since it's for shoreline management and explicitly tidal shorelines, it really is mostly for Virginia and Maryland, where most of the tidal shoreline lies. There's a tiny bit of tidal shoreline in southwestern Delaware, but I'm not sure that we're really accounting for that at this point. It's such a small amount. But nevertheless, you can see that the prevented sediment protocol is intended to be calculated on a site-by-site basis. In other words, what your site is, what the shoreline retreat rate is there, or the shoreline migration rate is, and then you calculate those reductions. The others that are based on the vegetative practices, so protocols 2, 3, and 4, are all linked to an aerial extent of vegetation. And then it's just a pounds per unit. So you can see acres of vegetation. These are all aerial extent. And then it's a pounds per unit. So we can just calculate based on an aerial extent of wetlands created what the load reductions might be. So the other thing that was part of the original Shoreline BMP was the addition of what we call qualifying criteria. And this was in response to the fact that the load reduction values that were determined by the expert panel were fairly high. So wetlands are considered to be relatively efficient, in fact, highly efficient at vegetated wetlands, specifically highly efficient at nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment load reductions. And there was a concern that the outcome may be shoreline management along shoreline reaches that otherwise would be best to be maintained in a natural state, but that they would not be maintained in a natural state because there might be entities that are interested in getting the BMP TMDL credits, either their MS4 multiple sewer localities or for their state watershed implementation plans. So the idea here was we did not want to create a perverse incentive for shoreline management practices where the best outcome still is for a shoreline to be in its natural state, for it to be able to accrete and you know, for sediment to be able to erode off of the shoreline to feed the adjacent beaches and wetlands, and or for the shoreline to accrete, and for the natural systems to just operate in that way. So this qualifying criteria basically says that that if your site is experiencing shoreline erosion, so first of all, you have to have shoreline erosion, and you can put a living shoreline, or when a marsh or fringe habitat is created, you should use a non-structural hybrid system or a hybrid system with a sill or with a breakwater. So basically what it's saying is where you can, that's what you should do. And then it goes through, and if that's not practical or feasible because of substrate depth or other constraints, so nearshore water is deep or the nearshore substrate is very mucky and won't support a sill or a breakwater. And then finally, there is a condition where in bulkheads and seawalls, and those really were identified through this process as largely commercial, industrial, marine areas, and or where the immediate depths were super deep and you couldn't implement one of the other practices. So for our calculations for load reduction calculation methods, so going back to our model outputs, we used 2 of the practices of the 11. We selected non-structural and plant marsh with sill because we wanted to determine those that had the maximal load reduction. So as I just showed you in the BMP table, the maximum load reduction comes from vegetative practices. We also selected shoreline with no existing marsh. So we did not try to model marsh expansion. We only tried to model marsh creation. We, once we had the shoreline management model, the output from the shoreline management model is a line. So it's an arc for GIS people. So it's a line, it has no dimensions. And so in order to calculate our aerial extent for load reduction, we went ahead and created polygons out of all of those lines with an 8-foot width. The 8-foot width was chosen to reflect the VMRC general permit number 2 criteria for minimum marsh dimensions. So basically we used the existing general permit with the expectation that it could be a driver for how people plan and design living shorelines for their marsh. And so that's what we used. So we determined the aerial extent, and then we applied the protocols. And as you can see, we actually did 2 different things in this particular report. We forecasted where living shorelines could be implemented. We also did a backcasting calculation using all 4 protocols where since the passage of the 2011 Living Shorelines legislation, we had done an assessment of where living shorelines were feasible according to a model, but were not implemented. We calculated the difference of all of those non-implemented living shorelines to determine what their load reduction may have been. So this is just an image to show you basically the buffering process that we use. So you can see on the left that it's just a line, and on the right, it's just a thick line. But the difference being that the line you can see in the left image, even though it appears to have dimension because we can visualize it, it's just a code. And on the image on the right, it actually is now an 8-foot wide marsh sill. So I'm showing you a table here of all our calculated shoreline for future implementation of living shorelines. And in the yellow, I wanted to point out, these are areas that may or may not be possible for marsh creation depending on the situation, but we did not model those. We modeled the areas that show up under the non-structural living shoreline and the plant marsh with sill here, and specifically defended no marsh. So you can see these are undefended shorelines. We use 2 different shorelines, the undefended shorelines with no marsh and the defended shorelines with no marsh. The undefended with marsh, this is an area where I said we did not model, but we could make these marshes wider if they did not meet the minimum width criteria. And as far as the defended, undefended, and defended, so with the undefended, that's pretty straightforward. That is a shoreline that has not had any structures or management alternatives put in place. And for the defended, we built into our model version 5.1 basically a retrofit set of rules wherein, depending on the rest of the physical parameters of that shoreline, if a structure, a revetment or a bulkhead existed on that shoreline, and it would be feasible to replace it with a living shoreline, we went ahead and modeled that. It is not intended to suggest to people that if they have a serviceable bulkhead and they want to replace it in place, or if they have a revetment on shore and they need to add more rock to it, that those things are often either allowed by code or you're able to do maintenance without even getting permission. So we weren't suggesting that those two things weren't feasible options. What we wanted to do was account for places where historically, perhaps when shoreline hardening was much more popular and acceptable, and the adverse impacts, especially the cumulative adverse impacts, were poorly understood. In other words, that wetlands were covered and or severed from the waterway, wetlands were filled to put these structures in place, and they may or may not have been in places where there even is high erosion rates, but it was done for aesthetic purposes or to create lawn, that in those conditions, it may be not only possible, but it may be preferable to naturalize the shoreline by removing a low-lying, low-energy bulkhead and replacing it with a living shoreline. So that's where the defended no marsh section comes in. So here's two maps basically of all of Virginia and then a close-up, and it just gives you an idea of what the output for the preferred shoreline BMPs, and you can get a sense. The color ramp in green are the greener, living shorelines types projects. The ones in purple are all of our sort of special conditions. And then the ones that don't show up quite as well, because they are a smaller subset, are the revetment bulkhead and revetment. So some of our special conditions here along, for instance, parts of the Potomac are probably related to the fact that there's lots of SAV along these sections of the Potomac, as are some of the cases in the Mob Jack Bay. So a lot of this is seek expert advice is probably due to ecological conflicts. And then of course, in the highly developed area of Norfolk and some of our urban areas with ports, it's probably because of commercial development. On the right, there's just a simple blow up of part of the Cortoman River. And you can again get a sense of, the output for the model shows non-structural living shorelines in the quieter upper reaches, and then plant marsh with sill. And then the mouth down here is probably more along the lines of breakwaters and other things. And so those shorelines are not modeled in this case because I'm only highlighting two of the outputs in this particular slide. So just you can get a sense of what that looks like. So here's what the numbers end up looking like. So for undefended shoreline, so all those shorelines that have not had a previous structure along them, when we made those marshes 8 feet wide, which is not particularly wide actually, but it would end up with creating 761 acres of marsh. And when we added in the defended shoreline where living shoreline was feasible, which is only parts of the defended shoreline, because I explained why that wouldn't be all of them, that was an additional 277 acres. So going forward, this fairly conservative estimate would be 1,000 some acres of marsh creation. And then the load reduction from that for the annual nitrogen load reduction. So for the protocols 2 and 3, you would get almost 88,000 pounds of nitrogen removed. And then protocol 4, the one-time uptake is another 7,000 pounds. And for phosphorus, the reduction would be about 5,500 pounds and another 300 or so for protocol 4. And these numbers are pretty high relative to our required load reductions under our watershed implementation plans. So one thing I wanted to just reiterate in closing is that the estimates from this model are fairly conservative. We only modeled and determined load reductions for 2 of the management practices, which included marsh vegetation, which is the non-structural, and the plant marsh with sill. So as I sort of noted, some other management approaches could incorporate, or sometimes do incorporate, marsh plantings. It's not uncommon for a small area of marsh, especially high marsh, to be incorporated into a breakwater. No action could have non-structural marsh put along the shoreline, even if it isn't necessarily required for erosion purposes. It could be done maybe for habitat enhancement, which is another thing that is not considered really in this model. This is the shoreline management model is to address perceived erosion protection needs, not enhancement or restoration interests. So, and again, the ecological conflict, wherein if it was SAV and it's farther offshore, and it might be an area where you do a breakwater, there might be some capacity to include some vegetative planting, and of course, special geomorphic features. So the other point is that we selected shorelines with no marsh, and I pointed that out. In other words, we didn't want to try to, at the time when we first were doing this, we didn't want to try to figure out how to model how you would increase width for existing marshes. However, that is an area where an opportunity for living shorelines is very high, actually. And so you might take a marsh that's only 8 feet and make it 15. So we modeled the minimum, but you also might take a marsh that's only 5 feet and make it 8. And so not only would you then increase the load reduction, but you would enhance water quality and habitat benefits through doing that. But right now our comprehensive coastal inventory data on marshes does not include marsh width universally for all of our localities. So that would be a little bit harder to model, but it is something that we could do, but it's certainly something that if people put projects there, they could qualify for credits. We also used, as I said, the minimum 8-foot marsh width, and a lot of times living shorelines are wider than 8 feet. And so 10, 12, 15 is not uncommon. And in fact, the slightly wider widths are in many ways preferred in terms of the wave and energy reduction capacity of the vegetation, because the wider the vegetation. Also, the sediment accretion tends to occur in the first so many feet of a marsh along the tidal shoreline. So if your marsh is a little wider, you get a lot of the sediment up front and then a little bit more sediment falling out in the behind area. So the load reduction could actually be increased if we were modeling marshes wider than 8, or if marshes wider than 8 feet were actually being built. And then I slightly alluded to the point that because this is tied to interest for erosion protection, it does not necessarily account for individuals and nonprofits and watershed organizations that are not only interested, but actually doing marsh creation and restoration for resilience, for some of the flood benefits and for some of the habitat and water quality benefits of marshes. And so where those things are occurring for those reasons, we may not be accounting for them in this particular model approach, but there may be ways to account for them in other processes. And so that's the end of my talk. And I think I didn't put an end slide on here, so I'm just going to leave it with that slide.
Thanks, Pam.
Sure.
If you're willing, if you're game, I have a couple of questions for you.
Yep.
The first question is related to sea level rise. Does the model assume that there's no need to raise the sand elevation to account for sea level rise? Basically, the commenter says, we find that most of our shorelines in the model call for non-structural living shorelines, but that would mean planting at the current elevation instead of adding a rock sill so that you could raise the elevation of the marsh, so that the sand elevation could be raised now, sort of alluding back to what Scott was saying, is do we raise the elevation of the marsh now, or do we wait and do it later? But the shoreline management model, I guess the question is, does it account for sea level rise?
The shoreline management model is not a predictive future projection model. It is a current condition model. So it doesn't explicitly account for sea level rise. One thing I would point out is that obviously raising the plane of the elevation surface is one way to do that. The other is whether or not that shoreline, and this is one thing that we talk about quite a bit, whether that shoreline already has an existing topography. In other words, it's flat enough that the marsh may also retreat. So there's several ways to consider that question. You know, increasing the elevation up front when you construct, and or allowing for or assuring that the marsh can migrate backwards. So in other words, it's the vertical lift and the horizontal movement, both of which, but the model does not account for that. This particular model doesn't.
But you certainly could account for it in your design, as you say, by including the riparian buffer area perhaps as a reserved area or a planned area for future marsh migration, if that's possible. Another question was about, let's see, Are there plans to study hybrid systems that combine features of revetments and living shorelines to determine new BMPs?
You mean, okay, so I'm going to interpret that question as different sections along a reach.
So I think
Or is
for
that-
the shoreline management BMPs,
Mhm.
currently they consider revetment or a living shoreline. Is there any effort to combine those two approaches for a BMP?
Well, I think for a BMP qualification, any section along any reach, even if it's combined with another feature, could qualify because it's marsh creation. So for instance, if you, all right, so here's the problem. So in order to meet the qualifying criteria, you have to do the preferred option. However, I don't necessarily think that that is being as robustly tracked as just marsh creation. So Department of Conservation and Recreation is doing the tracking. The reporting goes to the Department of Environmental Quality, and that's what gets put into our data that we submit for the Bay program. Okay, so that's sort of complicated in of itself. And if a marsh and sill were to be put channelward of a revetment, while VIMS would not call that a living shoreline and a lot of other entities wouldn't call that a living shoreline, the marsh creation arguably could qualify for load reduction credits if that's what the person is alluding to, because you've created the marsh. So if I would argue that wouldn't meet the qualifying criteria, but my guess is that that could be counted and probably is being counted and loaded into our accounting process, which is called NEAN, if anybody wants to know about that.
We did put into the chat box a link to the full report related to this study. It's available from the our library archive at VIMS if you want to read more about what Pam was talking about. So you can check it out on that link.
And I also, their Chesapeake Bay program has a one-pager fact, or is it a two-pager fact on how to verify living shorelines, shoreline management BMP credits. That could be helpful.
And another question is related to the marsh width that you were referring to. The model study that you did only looked at 8 feet of marsh, but is there a difference between high marsh and low marsh, or for nutrient reduction? Is there more nutrient reduction if you have a wider variety of marsh plants, or is it really the intertidal part of the low marsh that provides most of the nutrient reduction? Is there a difference?
So the presumption is that, and most of the research had been focused on spartina alterniflora low marsh. There has been a little bit of work on high marsh, sort of meadow, not specifically by species. So what we don't know, what scientists don't know, is what's the uptake ratio for juncus? What's the uptake ratio for disticulus? We don't necessarily know by species. Most of the work's been done at the community level and focused on low marsh. And so if somebody were to be on a high marsh shoreline, or for some reason went ahead and just built a living shoreline that was a high marsh, which could happen, they may be getting some credit that's a little bit bigger than otherwise, because most of the data that supports the BMP crediting, it came from studies of spartina alterniflora and mixed community marshes. So it's actually an area of interest in the scientific field to continue to look at more precision in those load reduction values and the plant values.
I don't see any new questions specific to you, Pam. The report, like I said, is available for you to review. That is kind of sometimes a data deep topic. If you're not involved with the TMDL crediting process, or that's not something that you are engaged with, I encourage you to check out the Chesapeake Bay program, Shoreline Management BMPs, for more information, because this is also very relevant for anybody involved with living shorelines and installing them, that water quality protection, nutrient reduction is an important factor. And I'd also like to let you know that there are new studies that we're trying to get underway to build a nutrient reduction calculator for living shorelines. because the table that Pam showed you is based on estimates that came out of the literature review. Is that correct, Pam? And now that we've been doing some ecological studies of living shoreline marshes, we know exactly more about what nutrient reduction they're capable of, and we'd like to start using those numbers through a user-friendly calculator. So I just wanted to let you know that hopefully that's something we can have in a future study or webinar report for you as we try to put that information together.
So I would quickly add, Karen, that one thing that turned out that we were very happy about was some of the monitoring. So scientists at CCRM actually did nutrient uptake modeling, or sorry, not modeling, monitoring of 8 or 9 living shorelines, a fairly good number of living shoreline sites mostly in Virginia. And part of that information actually went into the Living Shorelines book that was edited by Dr. Bilkovic and Dr. Mitchell. And the numbers that they got working with some other biochemist folks were basically compatible and consistent with the earlier research. So that was actually good to know, because much of our earlier research is based on, the other thing is it's based on natural marshes, because before that, we didn't have any good monitoring data for constructed marshes. There was some, and most of the constructed marshes were constructed for mitigation purposes, not necessarily for shoreline erosion control. So there had always been some questions. And so knowing that that research basically validated and concurred with some of the previous research means, at least as of right now, the numbers are probably pretty good, but we definitely need to have some more studies to really look at that.
Here's another question that just came in for you, Pam. Many living shoreline solutions call for hardened structural components like sills. Do these create water quality benefits? The resiliency that the hard structures provide is a key decision factor. So is there any water quality benefit to these sill structures?
So probably. It hasn't yet been codified. So I know that, for instance, oysters, there's a lot of work right now going on in oysters and getting oysters credited for as BMP practices because they're filtered. So the interesting thing about the way the bay modeling works and the validation process works is, in order to get the credit, then the pollutant needs to be removed from the system. So it's problematic if you have, for instance, oysters filtering, and then eventually the oyster gets eaten by another critter and dies or whatever, and all that nutrient uptake that the oyster did stays in the system. So it isn't removed. So right now, the oyster BMP is only for oysters that are removed. So there is one approved BMP, and that's for oysters that are removed. But arguably, oysters, barnacles, mussels, lots of filter feeders jingle shells settle on rock structures. And so there definitely is some, at least, local filtering that occurs and some reduction in pollutants. But the way the accounting happens, in order for you to get credit, it has to come out of the system. So I guess if they're all filtering, we'd have to go out there and pry them all off the rocks to get the water quality credit. But be mindful of the fact that it's not just about water quality, and those things add a huge amount of habitat value. And so it's a trade-off a little bit. So you get the resilience from the rock, you get the habitat from all the creatures that live in and on the rocks. And you just might not be able to get water quality crediting for that particular thing.
And I would just like to clarify that what Pam is explaining, there's a difference between water quality credit and water quality benefits. So having a living oyster reef community on sill structures and breakwaters certainly contributes to water quality. It helps keep the water clearer, increasing clarity, as well as providing the habitat value. But in order to get TMDL credits for the Chesapeake Bay programs, watershed improvement plan goals, that's what she means by credits. So just to make that clarification. So we do have some time now to go back to some of the questions for Scott, if he's still hanging in there with us and doesn't mind joining Pam and I on the panel. If he could either at least unmute himself. There he is. And I have some questions for you, Scott, about what you are presenting to us. I think I'll save that one for next. So we're talking about sea level rise resilience, and in some of your profiles, you showed the addition of sand or raising the height of the structure. But what about the sill sinking into muddy bottom? Is there any way that you, this questioner asked if you key it in as part of the core for the sill to reduce sinking? And how much is sinking of these sills a factor for resiliency?
Well, you need to figure out that sinking thing right off the bat. That's why you go out and do probes and cores and check the bottom, because there are areas where the rock will sink and you have to accommodate it with more rock, gabion mattresses and whatnot. So I guess the question is, if you add rock to the existing rock, will that load maybe cause it to sink? And I think that's an interesting question, and I think that that is that's a valid thought. And I suspect if you have it designed and built to accommodate the geotechnical forcings, the addition of rock, most bottoms are in pretty good shape. If you can walk on it, it'll hold rock. And so these sills are not huge. And so the same, you're basically turning the sill into sort of a breakwater cross section. So, but it warrants further consideration, I would say, in that regard. But I suspect that once your rock is in there, and if in any settling, unless the bottom is really bad, you might think twice about doing it to begin with. Settling of rock structures usually occurs during construction. And so you'll see it settle, and you might have to accommodate that by adding rock to get it to the proper elevation. So that's a good consideration. So we'll keep an eye on that.
And the survey profiles you showed, you include taking a height of the sill, right? You measure the elevation of the sill. So that is something that you could monitor over time, right?
Yes, we actually take that into consideration. We haven't seen any significant movement. You know, the error is plus or minus 1/10 of a foot in the survey anyway. So, but we haven't seen any mass sinking. Although there are other projects we've done over the years where the breakwater has sunk, and so up in Stafford County where the bottom was bad, and so, but even at that, it's still functioning.
Here's another good question for you, Scott. I'm glad somebody asked this question. In some of the more protected areas, currents and eddies appear to have a more significant impact on the shoreline than fetch distance does, wind waves. Are you looking at guidance where such conditions could exist? And I would add to that, how would you change your living shoreline design for currents, strong tidal currents moving along the shoreline, or eddies that might be a result of just the dynamics of how water moves?
Well, it's part of the site assessment part of the project. I mean, you'll know if you have currents. We've got 3-knot currents sitting over in Yorktown, and that's a consideration. It can also be a cause of scour in front of the structure. So scour can be wave induced or current induced, and if you have either one of those, typically what you do to accommodate that is you have a larger scour toe out in front of it to accommodate the potential loss in the near shore. There were some structures put on Smith Island a 3 years ago, and to accommodate the potential scour, the toe of the structures were 10, 15 feet wide, and that has occurred. That scour has occurred, and those toes have gone down with the scour. So that's a real concern, because we've seen structures over the years where scour has caused the face of the structure of the jetty to actually migrate and separate the armor. So those are conditions that are usually expected, but sometimes not. So it's part of figuring it out.
And then another question for you, Scott, is about the plants again. What is the mortality rate? How many plugs floated out? How many sort of planted plants have to be replaced?
I think, and I think Walter would agree, you should plan on 10 to 20% replanting, just from plants dying. If they wash out, you didn't plant them deep enough. We've seen that too.
Yes, it's very important when doing living shoreline plantings that each marsh plug get packed well. And you can plant them very deeply. And especially if you're using a volunteer corps, a group of volunteers, you need to have somebody go in behind them and do some quality assurance of their planting to make sure that each plug is packed in. But then you still have to do inspections right after planting to replace any washed out plugs. That's not an uncommon sort of maintenance practice that needs to be done until the marsh takes hold and starts to grow on its own.
Correct.
Another question for you, Scott, is who did the design work for the projects that you told us about? That's what I thought. Scott's shop.
Some of it was.
Go ahead.
Shoreline Studies program, and then part of other teams, Maryland DNR, stuff like that.
And there's a lot of information about the different sill structures and projects that Scott talked about available on the Shoreline Studies website that I believe, if we haven't already, we'll definitely make sure you have a link to that. Yes, the Shoreline Studies program website that was put into the chat box. I encourage you to visit that because you can see more information and pictures about these projects, including some of the construction sequences. And then under the Living Shorelines Design Guidance page on Scott's website, you'll see some course materials where we taught classes, and there's some additional presentations that you can look at that show the sequencing and some of the other information about these projects. So Pam, I have another question for you about the hardened structures question again. If qualifying conditions are met, Protocol 1 and the default protocol do afford a water quality credit to hardened structures. And that's referring to revetment and bulkhead. Is that correct?
Yeah, right. Because Protocol 1 is all about sediment prevention, sedimentation prevention. And so a tied up shoreline, however it's tied up, will keep that sediment from going into the waterway. The reason it was listed as a qualifying condition, though, as I pointed out earlier, was some of that sediment's good sediment and some of it's necessary for the persistence of our natural features. And so it's a bit of a trade-off. And that's why sometimes just thinking of something from just one perspective, just erosion control or just water quality or just habitat or just resilience, gets us in a situation where we make unintended, we have unintended perverse consequences. And so it's helpful to keep the other things in mind.
Would that thinking also apply to marsh sills and marsh edge erosion? If you are abating the loss of sediment from the edge of a marsh with a marsh sill, could it be also fall under that same Protocol 1? So
yes, it would, absolutely.
So you just have to somehow demonstrate the marsh edge erosion rate to quantify that.
Right, and you can use mapped erosion rates, like from Scott's shop in Maryland, they have erosion rates. So generally that's what they use. I mean, you could arguably go out and assess it over time, but most of the information is largely available. And so it's using that existing information.
And what Pam is referring to is something that we didn't talk about today, but many of you may be interested in, Scott's shoreline evolution data. There's a series of, there's an interactive map on his website that has erosion rates mapped out along the shoreline. And the previous data set was looked at the shoreline from 1937 to 2009. Well, the Shoreline Studies program has updated a lot of areas through 2017. And as they get that information, correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, that these are being added to the maps. And if you go to that site now, some of the areas are now showing mapped areas with data updates to 2017. And that's the Shoreline Evolution section of his website. Anything you want to add about that, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, we've updated to 2017. We've found some differences, but the bulk of the erosion, the longer term, the longer comparison you get, the better the number is. Because sometimes there's a lot of you get short-term changes don't always reflect the longer-term trend. So it's we use it a lot in looking at sites and looking at the fetch and what the material resistance versus the hydrodynamic forcing is on any particular shoreline.
So that shoreline change analysis for Virginia, that is for Virginia, can be used for both designing your living shoreline, looking at the site to as part of your assessment process to design a project, as well as calculations for nutrient reduction credits that Pam was telling us about. So that is a useful tool. And we're happy to help anybody find their location or locality or their shoreline to see what kind of data is available for that. So Scott, I'm saving the most frequently asked question for last. With the few minutes that we have left, is the cost per square foot question mark.
Cost per square foot?
Cost per square foot. What is the cost per square foot of these projects? Do you have a rough estimate or a range? Because people ask this all the time.
Cost per linear foot is usually how the question is
per
posed.
linear foot instead of square foot.
Yeah, and so that takes into account the rock, the sand, and the plants. So, depending on your setting, low energy could be 100 to 300 a foot. Medium energy could go up to $600 a foot. Open water nowadays, Chesapeake Bay could be $1,500 a linear foot of shoreline for a large sill / breakwater. The problem with those, you kind of gotta, those are just generalities. They don't really provide, and I think Jim Cahoon said it in an email the other day, it's kind of difficult to compare without looking at the specific site and its particular nuances, because there's so many factors. Access, the size of the structure, but basically hundreds of feet versus thousands of feet as you go from low to high energy shoreline. And level of protection. If you want to put a little sill out on the Chesapeake Bay that'll last a day, you can do that. But there's the challenge. How much money do you spend on what level of protection are you looking for? If you have a house that's getting ready to go in, you'll probably spend more money on that than if you have a piece of farmland that you're trying to abate. So it makes for interesting discussions.
And there's a lot more information about all of this that I'm going to start sharing my screen to wrap us up today. For more information about living shorelines, you can check out both of our programs' websites. CCRM and the VIMS Shoreline Studies program have websites dedicated to living shorelines. You can also contact Scott and Pam directly, and here are their email addresses again that were entered into the chat box earlier. And our two programs are currently working on additional living shoreline guidance and training opportunities in the future, like the annual workshop. The original plans for this year's Living Shorelines training kind of got sidetracked because we still can't have large classes in person yet. So we're working on alternative plans, and let us know if there's any particular subjects or focus areas related to living shorelines that will benefit you the most to help us plan for these future training sessions. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, your feedback is very welcome. Any feedback about today's webinar or the entire Shoreline Management webinar series is really welcome and needed. There are several ways you can let us know what we can do to improve our tools and advisory services for you. You can enter a chat box message in the few minutes that we have left right now. We're going to be sending out a post-webinar evaluation survey to everybody that registered for the webinars, regardless of whether you were able to participate or not. And I encourage you to complete that brief survey if you have a chance. You can also just send us a direct email to ccrminfo@vims.edu. That's another way that we'd love to hear from you. I'd like to say thanks again to Scott and Pam, today's webinar presenters, and a very special thanks to Circe Gonzalez for her role as producer behind the scenes for this entire webinar series. And certainly, thanks to all of you, the participants, for tuning in today. And we have to say goodbye for now. Stay well and have a great day.